and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Friends, how many things have you done 400 different times in your lives? I mean, we've all put on our pants or brushed our teeth far more than 400 times, at least I hope, or else you're making a dentist pretty rich. I hope you've not gotten married 400 times. That would be quite impressive. But is there a project, a thing that has, like, every time you do it, there's a start, a middle, and an end? It takes multiple hours. Each one's a little bit different, and you've done that 400 different times? I'm asking because this is the 400th episode of Superhero Ethics. Technically. Now, I say that because there have been some rebroadcast episodes over the years. There have been times where I've switched from one particular server to another, and a couple may have been lost or double added. I'm now just trying to vamp to see how long I can go while Paul tries to count 400 things on his fingers.
I'm up to 45, just okay, for the audience at home.
That's pretty good, although that's a number that we generally think pretty badly of right now.
Yeah.
But, you know, looking at 400 episode, since 390, I've been thinking, what am I going to do with the 400th episode? And I had plans of a whole big panel of discussion. I had plans about looking at what are some of the core questions over the years. And then I thought, you know what? Let's go back to the beginning. Let's kind of look at what has changed since we started this. Paul was my original, not co-host. Paul was a guest.
I think I was a co-host at first.
No. Originally, you were a returning guest, and then by like episode 4, I think you.
Well, episodes 1 and 2, I didn't know it was a podcast.
That's true.
Yeah, you were like, we're just going to talk, and I'll record it. I'm like, okay, sure, cool, sounds good.
I didn't know what a podcast really was either. I also didn't really know what speaking honestly to guests apparently was either. But either way, that has much more to do with Paul.
We've come a long way.
We've come a long way.
The
point being, I started this in 2016, and obviously a lot has changed since then. In terms of our nation, in terms of
I'm up to 250 by the way now.
Okay, so, cool. Yeah. So what are you actually counting?
Each episode.
Huh?
I'm counting the episodes. I'm What do you mean?
Oh, okay. He's being a Muppet. Yeah. That's fine.
Okay, Supergirl, and then this one. That makes 400.
Okay, cool.
Yeah,
cool.
Yeah. No, I totally remember every single episode. And you're right, there were some doubles in there, but then there's some that I think were missed. So, you know, it's well,
my being impressed enough by Paul that I'm not quite sure when he's fucking with me, excuse me, is even done. I hope there's no fan fiction about us out there. That's not a part of our friendship. But anyway, the point being, in the 400 episodes we've done in those 8 years, a lot has changed for the two of us, for the way we approach things, for the way we approach this podcast, and I think in the fandom and the movies and media that we talk about. And so that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today. I wanted to talk about where we were when we started and sort of how we feel about this podcast project and the media that we are talking about and the media infrastructure in which we're talking about 400 episodes 8 years later.
So 10 years later.
10 years later.
I'm 2016.
I was trying to, I was 45. Like, oh, does that mean that we've been through about
a decade?
50 episodes a year?
It's been almost a decade. Yeah, about 40 a year. So that's like, you know.
It's still pretty good. Pretty good.
It's 10 a season.
So, Paul, starting with that, talk to me about where you were in terms of like what you were thinking about media and about what your voice had to say about it and what your thoughts was about coming onto this, not a podcast, maybe a podcast project 10 years ago.
Yeah. So 10 years ago, it was one might call it a pivotal time in American politics or US politics. And that was one of the periods of time when I was most engaged in terms of not just paying attention to the news, but just having conversations with people. And we were just talking about debate a moment ago, but, you know, trying to like argue with people online, basically. Like I was doing a lot of that. Yeah. To the point where I, you know, lost contact or chose to lose contact with, you know, one person who just was very like awful about it. And I think the thing is, it's like the things that we talk about and opinions we might have, it's like when um, when they are kind of these hypothetical external things, I think it's really easy to argue about them in a little bit of a detached way, like, well, we'll just agree to disagree,
Right.
right? But when those things have real consequence for either for us or for people we know, or just such consequence that it's, we can't really like divorce the intellectual conversation from a certain emotional aspect, I think. That, and like maybe we shouldn't also, right?
Hmm.
Like, I think it becomes harder to have some of those conversations. And um you and I were having those conversations at the time. We have for maybe 2 decades before that too,
Yeah.
right? Um, and so for me, I think there was a certain, like, if I look back to like when I was 5, which I think I'm out of frame right now, but there's a picture there where I'm about 3 or 5 or something like that, and I don't like, on a certain level, I feel like my core values haven't really changed, like,
Hmm.
at all, basically. But over time, I'd say that my understanding of the world has changed
Yeah.
in a way that sort of the application of those values of like what, and I say values, I mean like sort of like what matters to me,
Hmm.
and like essentially looking at the world, what I think sucks and what I think is great, and I think I've, in the last decade, lost a lot of hope for humanity,
Hmm.
where I think back then I was more hopeful that like maybe people could take their better qualities and kind of work together in a way that those better qualities led to a better world for everybody.
Hmm.
Because I really do believe, like, when we talk about the kind of, like, billionaires versus not billionaires, or
Hmm.
I think like there's an element of stupidity to like the notion that even the wealthiest, most powerful people are actually better off in the reality we have than in the
Right.
one we could have.
Yeah.
Like, maybe people could live forever if they wanted to.
Hmm.
Like it, or like maybe there places, maybe you wouldn't just be able to have a sort of suborbital whatever kind of trip to quote unquote space, but like maybe you could go to Mars, like,
Right.
because humans had actually been collaborative enough, and maybe it wouldn't be like, well, we're going to have to go to Mars because we're destroying this planet.
Right.
So just like thinking back to then, that felt like a time when there was like room to pivot and
Hmm.
and and move in a direction that I would have found a lot better
Yeah.
than looking back at like what's happened over the last decade, and it's like it feels like not a lot of it's been good.
Yeah. Yeah, I can really understand that. And it's interesting because I think you and I share a lot of views on that. And also but I think I would describe myself as coming from a very different place. Um, the first thing I want to name, and this is by way of really a thank you more than anything else, but also just kind of to name it because it is a part of this conversation, is if any of you have listened to, um, uh, hold on, give me 1 second. Oh, okay, got it. If any of you have listened to Kevin Smith talk at various points about the various podcast projects that he does. How about now? If any of you listen to Kevin Smith talk about the various podcast projects he does, particularly with Jason Mewes, his longtime, very close friend, the Jay of Jay and Silent Bob, he's often talked about how, and Jay has talked about this, Jason Mewes has talked about this, that he was really going through very bad addiction issues and trying to come out the other side, and that they started the podcast in large part to give him something to do, to give him something to kind of focus on, and that it was in large part a big part of helping Jason get out of that place that he was in and get to a much healthier place that he's alive and thriving and as I understand it, been on top of that addiction for many years. This is was kind of a similar thing. In 2016, I was coming out of a pretty bad mental health crisis. I'd lost my career, and my mother had passed away, and a lot of other things had happened. And I started this superhero ethics project, which, by the way, was supposed to be a website with an occasional podcast to help advertise it. Um, oops. Well, I mean, that's
I remember at least one article or one piece
I think there were
from that.
three. That
Yeah.
technically now all of the podcasts are blog entries, but
Oh,
there you go.
yeah.
There's a whole other conversation about how the media landscape has changed. But, and I think there were a couple of people, but Paul more than absolutely anybody else, who kind of got involved in part because I was like, dude, I need something to do. And for me, that is a lot of how this project started, was both just I need something to focus on, so I'm not just thinking about all the shit in my life I've broken because of the fucked up things I've done, but also just like I need a way to get my voice out there. And here's where I can start talking about this kind of stuff you were talking about. The For me, I think in 2016, I was seeing a lot of what you were seeing. I was engaged in a lot of those debates, and I was getting incredibly frustrated with how much. And you and I had actually had a conversation just before we started online about how the term debate can often, is maybe something we shouldn't be so fond of as often, because like a debate where two people are fixed in their sides, they're just trying to convince other people and they're not really listening to each other. That doesn't really help anything in a lot of ways. And I say that as someone who used to be very proud that I was a championship level debater in college and high school. But and especially, the debates we were having during that year. And the funny thing was, I'm not even talking about arguing with Republicans.
Yeah.
I
was just thinking that.
A lot of the worst debates that we were having was how do the Democrats fight against what's happening in terms of Trump and all of the Sanders versus Clinton and all of the moderate Democrat versus leftist Democrat and misogyny issues and racist. Can you hear me now? What's the last thing you heard me say?
Misogyny issues and race issues.
It was moderate Democrat versus leftist Democrat. It was, what's the role of misogyny in all this? What's the role of racism in all this? What's the role of, all these different things? And also just questions of who's being an idealist and who's being a pragmatist and what is the strategy? And it was just a whole bunch of people talking past each other. And that was also kind of a time when we talk a lot about superhero fatigue. That was not superhero fatigue. That was when a lot of these movies were coming out, and a lot of these movies were just the basis of a lot of conversation. And I remember sometime in the last couple of months before I started this project, I had a couple of conversations where just talking about what's happening in the world wasn't getting anywhere. But I was able to sort of use Star Wars or MCU or DC stuff as metaphors to talk to people. And I was finding that was getting through to people. And sometimes it was to just talk about base values. Sometimes it was to exactly talk about a thing. But it was connecting with people in ways that I hadn't. And I think for me, more than anything else, that was the impetus for this project, was the idea of I no longer think that I am able to just say to people, hey, here's why you should care about the poor. Here's why that person who looks different from you, who acts different from you, and might make you a little uncomfortable, maybe sitting with that feeling of uncomfort and trying to find the shared humanity is actually better than just rejecting them because they're uncomfortable. Or maybe we could look at, why is it that we're locking up huge amounts of people, most of whom don't happen to look like us, the people who are in power, white, moderate men, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think more than anything else, that was really what kind of was the impetus for this, was like, how can we, especially because it felt like we talk about this as the golden age of superhero movies. Actually, we don't use that phrase golden. Let me just think of it again. We talk about how like there's this huge push of superhero movies and Marvel and DC and all of them. We've always had those though. Like a big part of my childhood was the Tim Burton Batman movies, and before that, there was the Richard Donner Superman movies, and in between, there was all the various iterations of X-Men movies and Spider-Man movies. Like, we've had Superman movies and superhero movies long before Kevin Feige met Robert Downey Jr. But it felt like this was an age when those movies were starting to really grapple with issues a lot bigger than just, oh, do I wear the cape or not? Do I become a hero or not? And will my person love me in the end? So I think that was kind of more than anything else, what really was at the heart of starting this project was this kind of media is asking these questions. Let's talk about them further.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, thinking back, I remember that period and basically being like, okay, this will be something fun to do with Matthew, who needs some fun stuff to do, and a way that we can spend some time, doing something that feels like we're, creating something, right? Well, that is literally doing that. But then also, I totally agree. And I feel that just trying to express an opinion kind of out of context or talking about things in kind of broad political terms, I think hits a lot differently than when you see Sam Wilson getting harassed by cops, even though he's Falcon, like,
right.
It's like,
and to be clear that you're not talking about the character that Sam Wilson plays. We're talking about the fact that like Sam Wilson himself, literally the actor, got harassed by cops a couple times.
I was talking about Falcon and the Winter Soldier.
Oh, never mind. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if there's another Anthony Mackie, no, it's okay.
No, we can keep going. Okay, that's fine. That's
fine. And I mean, obviously, these things happen in real life as well, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes, but I think seeing things reflected in fiction sometimes is easier it's easier to talk about sometimes, because in a way it's like it's less real because it's literally just made up, but it's also can feel more real because like when you look at a news story that's like just using someone's name, you're like, I don't know, okay, whoever that is, right? But then you see someone eating breakfast in a film, and it's like, well, I know that character, right? I know that person. Like, I think it's easy to feel like fictional characters more than real people, because you get to see a part of their lives that you don't get to see most people. Although, now I know all sorts of celebrities and whatever people are trying to share all bits of their life with other people and, access and whatever. But like,
well, and I'm really glad you brought up the Sam Wilson example, even if I mixed up the name of the character.
Anthony Mackie.
The actor has himself also been harassed by cops at various points, as he's talked about. But because it's interesting that, like, I remember that show, that him being harassed by cops was an important part, but even more so, I think, for a lot of people, him going to try to get a loan at a bank.
Yeah.
And I remember like that to me for a while was kind of one of my like, look, this is like the proof of what I'm kind of get at with this podcast. Was a lot of people I knew, and I'm not claiming because this podcast, a lot of fantastic other people were talking about this, especially black folk, looking at how, like, what does that moment really show? And I remember hearing from a lot of white people and our people all across the spectrum who were like, I never really got it until I was seeing Sam Wilson deal with that at the bank. And that banker who was not like saying the N-word and like ranting about, the racism.
Normal dude.
Yeah, a normal dude.
That's the point.
Clearly liked Sam Wilson and thought Sam Wilson was pretty damn cool, but also had racial bias that they probably weren't aware of, but that was playing out in their making it harder for Sam Wilson to get a bank loan and
institutional bias, right? It's like more than just the individual. It's not like a personal bigotry. It's like this deep, baked in issue. And
I think in some ways, I'm really glad you made that pivot, because I think that's so true, and it's why it's so needed, because I think, like, show me a cop who says the N-word while he hurts somebody. Like, that's a very clear, obvious thing to see.
Yeah, and pro-cop people are going to be like, that guy sucks. That's the bad apple. Get rid of them, and then everything's fine. Exactly.
Whereas if I say, show me the institutional bias of racism built into policing ever since they were slave catchers 150 years ago, or 100, whatever, I'm bad at math.
Yeah, a little more. But
160, 70. Yeah. That's a lot harder to show. And you're right. So something like Sam Wilson being denied, or I don't remember if he's actually denied or what exactly has happened, but like that, having bad experience at the bank, trying to get a loan, he's a literal hero. He literally is part of the Avengers, and yet still it hits him.
Yeah.
That's a way, I think, of making it real for people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And those types of institutional things, I mean, like, individuals can tell their stories, of course.
Yeah.
Right. But it's, I think it's, again, it's like seeing something in fiction, just it can hit differently, and maybe even just like make people more receptive to hearing, people's stories, essentially.
Yeah.
Right.
No, I think that's true. And I think that's, I think, a good place to start, because I'll be honest, I've been questioning what is going to happen with the future of this project. And part of that is I think the media landscape has changed a lot. There's just 8 million more podcasts out there now. There's a lot more superhero fatigue. Like, I think people don't hear the term superhero ethics and get really excited the way they might have used to. But also, just the media landscape of trying to share content has gotten much, much harder. And a part of it's because there's an awful lot of schlock out there. There's an awful lot of AI content. There's an awful lot of, people who are just using content as an excuse to sell things, et cetera, et cetera. But also the term that I love, the shitification of the internet. 8 years ago, 10 years ago, I could post a link saying, hey, I just did a talk about Sam Wilson trying to get a loan from a bank on this episode. You should check it out. And anyone on the internet who had or at least anyone in my circle and their circles who had expressed any interest about Sam Wilson or the MCU or banking or anything like that was probably going to see my link.
Right.
Now, I post this kind of things and like 5 or 10 people get to see it.
Yeah.
So just
because they're like, whoa, there's a link here? It might take people away from our site. No.
No, you can't do that. You have to keep them on Facebook, et cetera. So, but that should be complaining of. Every podcaster in the world is dealing with that. The real thing is, I am now no longer sure that it feels like this is no longer an area where really we can have these productive conversations, because the internet conversations have become so much, oh my God, that's too woke, it's terrible. No, you think it's too woke, therefore actually it's the best thing ever.
Can I share my experience briefly?
Yeah, please.
So, as I mentioned, back in 2016, a decade before today, when I was very on social media and arguing with people and talking with people, it wasn't all bad, right? And I was fairly miserable, I think, as a result of that. And then maybe a year later, I just stopped and just completely avoided it all and felt better. And then at some point I went back to it, partially because I was like, well, I'm going to make some stuff at some point, so I want to be able to promote it. And then also I'd like to be in contact with some friends that I mostly that I don't email with as much. Right. Yeah. And in going back to it, there was definitely a feeling of almost it's hard for me to say whether this is my own personal experience of when it's bright outside and you come inside and then you're inside in the dark for a while and then you go outside and it's bright and it feels brighter. It's did it get brighter, or is that me? Right. But I found some kind of niche communities like chess punks on what was then still called Twitter. And then over the last few years, again, I've shifted away from just being completely detached from any kind of social media and really just talking to people individually, except for Discord, right? Which really I only spend time in a private Discord groups mostly, where it's not just anybody can come in and whatever. And it's, the idea of a certain barrier to entry, just keeping people from coming in and trolling and spamming and whatever kind of. And more recently, since I put out my new book, which we'll talk about later. I have a copy here in my hand. It's nice. I enjoy it.
And there is a link to purchase that book and support this podcast in the show notes.
Yay.
Keep going.
So I was like, okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to kind of just, like post about it and also kind of like see what's going on and like talk to people and like see. And like, I thought it was bad 10 years ago. And I'm just like, the level of negativity I see about like everything. And I don't know whether it's like my feed. Oh, and for most of the last 10 years, I used something called Feed Blocker, but then I don't have it installed right now on what I was using. So like, I wasn't looking at the feed. I'd be like, I want to see what this person has to say, and I'll look at their feed, right? But like, just the general feed, it's like, it's such a morass of just like rage bait, other kinds of clickbait, and just people seeming so angry and unhappy. And it's like, I don't fault the people for it really, but it's like, it's people are perpetuating it, but it's designed to try and inspire those sorts of emotions a lot. Yeah. And then it just, the level of negativity on so many things just made me feel like, why would I want this to be part of my life?
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate because I do feel like the core idea of social media is like really positive.
Right.
It's like you can be in touch with and have contact with people that you would never see or contact on a daily basis because there's like too many or you're too far, know, and you can do that through email, you can do that through texting or some kind of chat or voice calls, but it feels like there is a really positive function for social media and like online conversation, but it's really hard to find beneath just the ocean of crap.
I think that is really incredibly true. And, and there is still some of it happening today, and some of it in shining a light on incredibly negative things. I think the genocide and the horrors that are happening in Gaza are only known about because of TikTok and social media. And, at a time when most of the regular media was not covering it until so many of us were seeing like Palestinians, showing like, look, this is my bedroom that got bombed. This is, let me show you my real life. We could see that directly. That is kind of an example of like one of the most horrible things to see, but that I think we have to see. But you can go also all the way to the other side, like the TikToks of Korean fans of their World Cup team discovering tequila and tacos in Mexico City as they're watching those games, or like the Scotsman taking over Boston and perhaps significantly changing the demographics of that city in 9 months. Whatever's happening, those are fantastic. And I feel like we still get that kind of moments. But what we used to have is, it used to be that two random people talking about the Superman movie or something they saw on the Daily Show or whatever, I might see what Joanne said to Bob and think, oh, that's kind of cool. I'm going to jump into that conversation.
Yeah.
And we were arrogant enough, and I think, but with some real things, I think, and so if you and I talk back and forth on Twitter, someone else might see that and have some positive response, and not just say, oh, well, you mentioned this, so let me sell you something, or let me tell you why you're terrible, or let me try to convince you to, join my multi-marketing, but all the communication stuff.
And it's not that those things don't happen anymore. The positive interactions, they're just so buried.
They're so buried, and it's so much harder to get to them, and a lot of people have given up on them, and so it becomes the cycle of, well, none of it, and then, like, I'm sure I'm going to get responses from people who are like, oh, but if you had just gone to Mastodon, if you just gone to Blue Sky, if you just gone to, and yeah, probably if we all picked one, but that never happened. And
who's we?
Right. Exactly. Like, also true. And that's the kind of broad social media in general. I want to narrow it down a bit though, to talk more about it with, these kind of stuff we're talking about with these movies, and this podcast. And just last week, let me second. last week's episode was on the Supergirl movie, and Jessica Palmer and I had a great conversation about it, about a lot of things we liked, but a lot of things that we thought didn't work so well. But one of the things we had to talk about was that it was very difficult to have that conversation right now, because months before the movie came out, a significant part, a loud part of the internet that is actually a lot smaller than it seems to be, but as you said, because loud voices get amplified, had decided this movie was going to be terrible because Millie Alcock had said something about maybe Kara could be bisexual, and she'd been critical of men, and so therefore everything was going to be woke, and that was terrible, and just going to these ridiculous extremes that are both horrific and 10 years ago I think would have been completely unbelievable, and yet now are just normal. Like, if it's a woman-led movie, if it's a black person-led movie, if it's a queer person-led movie, or any minority or whatever, this is just what we expect. And there has now been a rise of a response to that, which I think is completely reasonable and completely fair, but which says, no, this movie is the best thing ever, and if you don't like it, you're one of those terrible people.
Right.
And this is something that I got on board with a lot later than you did, but I remember, when you first told me you didn't like The Last Jedi, I had this moment of like, oh God, no, Paul can't be one of those people. That doesn't make any sense. Because there was so much, like, all the people who hated Last Jedi for these dumb reasons, and a lot more to do with racism and sexism and stuff. And then you were like, no, I just thought this part of the movie and this dialogue or this plot point didn't make sense. I was like, okay, that's a reasonable conversation. We can have that. And I felt bad that it must be hard for you to have to do that without, all that noise. And that's a lot what Jessica and I were talking about with Supergirl, that it is just, and again, I think the defense is important, and the, people saying that, like, this actress isn't attractive compared to some other attractive, like, Millie Alcock is beautiful. How you don't think that is ridiculous to me. But also just like,
also you could not. That's fine.
Yeah, I mean,
people are attracted to different people. Who cares? But like, that shouldn't be your talking point,
right?
If you're trying to criticize a movie.
And certainly, like, the meme of taking the most beautiful model face of one person playing Supergirl, and then taking a frame in the middle of a fight where she's grimacing because she's kicking someone in the face, and saying, look, who's more beautiful? It's like,
yeah.
But now when I look at it, and I admit I was concerned putting that post up, that podcast up, because I am seeing, like, I saw one person who had the title of the article in Variety was Supergirl Deserved a Better Movie. And it was very much the perspective of, this is a fantastic character. And here's a lot, and I admit, I've not read a lot of the article, but I've read some of it. And it is definitely not coming from a place of like, oh, this is terrible and we should have Superman and not Supergirl. It's coming from a place of like, look, here's some ways in which this movie could have been done a lot better, because the producers didn't seem to take it seriously enough because of their own misogyny and that kind of stuff. And yet the headlines about the response to the article was still, these are all misogynists, these are all terrible people, they clearly hate it because, et cetera. And it's just, how do you have a conversation with any nuance in the midst of that?
No, it's I mean, I have written down here the death of nuance, because that's where I wanted to go to. But I think I wrote something that actually was a blog or a piece of internet writing back in the day about how I thought Agent Carter deserved better than Agent Carter, where the series had a lot that I thought was great, to be honest. But then, like, the first season, I thought the first 4 episodes were really good. And then it to me, like, I felt like the character deserved a more well-written series with a more satisfying conclusion than the series delivered. And, I think we both feel that way about Wonder Woman 1984, right? I loved the first Wonder Woman movie. I think it's one of the best DC movies. And like, maybe probably the best not Batman DC movie. But like, then the follow-up was like, how is this like by the same people who did the other one? Because it was so weird and like rapey, and like, it was just like, what's going on here? And it was like, well, it's hard to, I mean, personally for me, it's not hard. Like, I'm just going to say what I think, and I'm going to ignore what people who I don't really know or respect are going to say. And that's not like a lack of respect for anybody else. It's like, I don't know you. I don't like, I'm personally not into that conversation. Like, that's not, I want to talk to people whose like opinions I already know I want to hear, right?
Yeah.
And then I'll disagree or I'll agree or whatever, and we'll have a conversation, not a debate, but a conversation. But like with that movie, it's like I don't know, but I can imagine there was a whole lot of like anti-feminist and misogynist, like probably anti-Latino, like because of like Pedro Pascal and whatever. And it's like there are actually a lot of movies or whatever that I'm like, I don't really want to spend a lot of time tearing this down and criticizing it, because there's people already doing that for like really bad reasons.
Yeah.
Or reasons that I disagree with. And so like it kind of doesn't need any additional whatever. But like, but if you ask me in my opinion, I'll be like, yeah, I don't think it's cool that like, Steve Trevor like possessed some dude's body and then, bang, and then Wonder Woman's like banging this guy who like she doesn't know, he's not there. Like what's that? And then it felt like very anti like Middle Eastern as well, which is interesting because like one of the writers like part like Lebanese, I think, and I was just like, what are we doing here?
Well, and that also raises another issue, which is that since the making of those movies, and maybe some of this was more available like when it was coming out, but certainly a lot more in the most recent years, in part because we're paying a lot more attention to it because of Gaza. Sure. Gal Gadot is someone who has a lot of opinions that I think a lot of other people find deeply problematic. And I'm not going to say she's on like J.K. Rowling level in terms of like using the influence that she has to spread hate and terribleness, but is on the spectrum to an extent that I am not comfortable. I'm not probably going to pay money to see another project that Gal Gadot is in.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think though that there's a part of the conversation that therefore wants me to go back and say, oh, when I thought Gal Gadot actually made a pretty good Wonder Woman, even though she's not the right, she's a lot more like, I mean, she's not small, but she's more like svelte instead of like bulky, the way that, Wonder Woman traditionally has been. But I still thought in that movie, she was a pretty damn good Wonder Woman.
Yeah.
I now know a lot of terrible things about her that make me not want to support projects she's in going forward. But that doesn't make me go back and say, you know what, actually, I'm wrong. I'm going to hunt through this movie and say, oh, her facial expression at this moment, oh, she's actually bad acting.
Yeah.
And I think that's often where the conversation is supposed to go. Yeah. And I think that is also another part that is, and part of it's because we now know a lot more about these actors and what they have to say. And I let me actually use that to actually ask you, because I think that's been a topic that you and I've often, I think, been a lot bigger on the how I'm going to feel about different kinds of, not how I feel about the art itself, but how I feel about whether I want to support it or not, has a lot to do with how those artists are using their platforms to express different opinions and stuff. But for you, I know, like, I mean, obviously we're talking about this, it's not something you are indifferent to. Where does that kind of play, and how has that changed for you in the last 8 years, 10 years? I really want to think 2016 was 8 years ago. It really was.
No, it's 2026. Yeah. The good thing is that means 2028 sooner, right? Maybe. I don't know. So has it changed for me? I don't think it's changed. I think I've always been very comfortable just not supporting things that I don't want to support, like, and cutting things out of my life that, I'm just like, I don't need that. I don't want to put my money there. But yeah, I mean, like, in terms of like, I really don't want to know much about actors. Like, I really don't. And like, if I do, it's like, sometimes if it's like good, it's like, okay, that's a nice story, like stories about like Keanu Reeves, or like listening to like Matt Damon tell stories, like he tells them really well, like there's exceptions, but like by and large, or like Anthony Stewart Head, which I think you did an episode on.
Oh, we definitely talked about him. Yeah, he recently passed away. We wound up not getting the episode together, but we tried to talk about him. He was Giles in Buffy, and Rupert in Ted Lasso, and also just an all-around fantastic guy. Yeah,
and like I read at the time, or like my mom read and told me about it, because Buffy was like a huge thing to her, like seeing as an adult and never having seen a character like her, and I thought Giles was like a really important character in that series, and kind of the way everything kind of fit together. But like a story about him, like his wife or partner, I think they didn't get married because reasons, right? But like was a vegetarian, and so like it was like an animal rights activist, and so he was a vegetarian, and at some point there were like ants that they were trying to get rid of, and he's like, well, can't we just ask them to leave, kind of? And and like I've had that same feeling, like, how do I get rid of these? Like, I don't want them here,
right?
I don't want to just like genocide them, you know what I mean? And like but like, so like when I hear something like that makes me like the person,
right,
and appreciate the person, like that's nice. But like I while watching a thing, like I don't want to be thinking this is a human, this is a meat puppet, this is like they're the character. I want to see the character. I don't really want to be thinking about the performance or whatever. And so like, but there's an extent to which I feel like I can mostly separate those things, where like I can still watch The Usual Suspects and see maybe the best performance in acting I've ever seen. And like, regardless of whatever or not the actor did, and but at the same time, like I respect that some people feel differently. And if that's something that compromises your enjoyment, or that you feel like, well, I don't want to financially contribute to that, like I get that. And I certainly don't have any, but like for me, like movies, it's like every movie, like, or at least almost every movie, has like dead animals on the craft services table. Like almost every movie is going to be made by a bunch of people who do a bunch of things that I think are bad, that I could, that I have real issue with, and that like I could just boycott like almost everything in the world for that. And so on some level, I have to kind of choose my battles, in that. And so the question is like whether a certain whether a certain element or a person or whatever exceeds a given threshold that I just like have to make up for myself, And Matthew will be back soon. I'm gonna clap. I'm not sure what that clap is, but yeah. So, so we're live, which I don't know if anybody watches these live, but I will ramble. Let's see. Maybe I'll read from my book until Matthew returns, and this definitely feel free to edit this out. Introduction. What is this book? This is just in case anybody's like watching live and, yeah. 7 months ago, I started writing a poker newsletter titled Friday Night is My Monday Morning. At the same time, I began a 1001 day poker challenge called Betting the House on Poker. The first 144 entries of the newsletter will focus on my mission to win a house in 143 weeks. This volume here is a compilation of the first 24 entries of Friday Night is My Monday Morning, lightly edited, along with 23 detailed hand breakdowns. It covers part 1 through 1 of 6. Okay, Matthew's back, so we'll put that aside.
To be very clear also, Friday Night is My Monday Morning is not, cannot, and should not be referred to as an FNM3 or FNM to the power of 3.
Very good. Yes. FNIM cubed.
Yeah.
Yes.
FNIM cubed.
FNIM cubed. FNIM. I actually just call it FNIM.
Yeah.
And the entire title of the book is actually Zims FNIM V1. So.
Exactly. So for reasons passing understanding, my computer is having all sorts of problems. I made a joke that the computer was so mad about Paul clearly.
And what do you think? I think maybe the computer was mad at Matthew because it evicted Matthew, and I am still here. Anyway, I went on a little bit of a ramble. Not really a rant. I wouldn't call it a rant. Wasn't particularly angry. Hand of the week number 10. Oh, yes. Well, yeah. Week 10 is titled Poker, Death, and Taxes. Cheerful stuff. Then we have, let's see, week 19. Take care of yourself. I hear a phone ringing in the background, but it is not my phone, for this is my phone. Although actually I do have two phones, but the other one isn't really assembled properly. I guess properly I have a well, more than 2 phones. I have many phones, but most of them are broken. And then I have another SIM card that's just like laying around.